Ethics and consciousness are two separate questions to at least some degree, and on some views they may become closely intertwined, and on other views perhaps not. I would certainly take the view that there is no special further question about consciousness or qualia that should affect the way we ask questions about ethics more broadly. We haven't developed systems of ethics that are designed to approach questions about artificial moral agents in detail, and certainly most of our ethical thinking historically has been about naturalistic moral situations. There is a question though in terms of what we would mean by an artificial moral agent, and we could, for example, look at an artificial moral agent as being an agent that is capable of understanding human ethical thinking, for example, but it may not be an agent that is itself something we would consider worthy of ethical consideration. At the same time, we might have the flip side of that. So we've got to ask where we're coming from and what our domain of concern is in terms of the ethical questions that we want to ask. It could so happen that in order for a system to comprehend ethical thinking, to be able to answer ethical sorts of questions, and perhaps contribute to the way we consider ethics or even make important ethical decisions, that such a system only needs to implement a certain kind of relatively narrow AI. It's certainly an open question as to whether we need a general intelligence in order to have that general intelligence successfully engage with ethical issues. But at the same time, there's quite a reasonable intuition which would be based around the notion that ethical problems are fairly general in scope, and so therefore that for a system to be able to engage with ethical conversation, it needs to have a certain kind of generality in its intellectual scope. On the other hand, if we're concerned merely with the ethical significance of a system, then we're looking at a very different set of questions. So, for example, we don't expect that non-human animals of certain kinds are going to be able to engage intellectually with various questions in ethics, but that doesn't mean that we don't accord them an ethical status, or at least there aren't arguments to say that we should accord them an ethical status. So it could also be the case that you want to look at the question about artificial agents from that angle. Maybe these agents cannot or do not engage with ethical concepts or understand them to a degree of sophistication that we'd consider important. That doesn't necessarily mean that these systems themselves won't be worthy of some kind of ethical consideration. It's a broad question. My view would tend to be towards a position that as systems get more general in their intelligence, their ethical significance, meaning the degree to which we should consider them as systems worthy of ethical consideration, will increase. So, as a general principle, a narrowly intelligent system will be less worthy of ethical consideration. There are a couple of other issues to consider here that go beyond perhaps the generality of the system. One is the intentional status of the system. So when we're looking at the actual content of an intelligent system, we may want to consider its intentional history in order to deduce what we think it should be accorded in terms of ethical due. And that intentional history is going to depend upon partly its embeddedness in society, partly upon its ability to have meaningful goals and aspirations and qualities that would usually form part of what we would consider ethical considerations. So intentionality is part of it, generality is part of it. It could so happen that at least some kinds of general intelligence, as they become more general, become more potent, but less efficient in terms of the way in which we could consider them to be narrowly applied, for example, to a particular task or a particular kind of economic activity. Certainly our own intelligence, though not perfectly general, seems to have a quality to it and seems to incur an ethical consideration which is broadly agreed upon, where we don't see ourselves as ends or as means, or at least we feel there are reasons why we should not consider ourselves in these cases. And this, of course, goes back to Kant, and although less explicitly to a very broad range of thinking about ethical problems. So it would seem there's an intuition there that as the system becomes more general, it's also going to be harder to tailor it to, should we wish to tailor it, should we even think that that's appropriate, to a specific narrow set of problems or outcomes. And in a sense, the system is going to become more complex as it becomes more general. And while it may be useful in the sense that you and I are perhaps occasionally useful in some way, whether by our own determination or by someone else's, we have a lot of contingent features, and in a sense we're just a complex ecosystem of dispositions and potentialities that make more and less sense at various times. So there's kind of a contingency to our existence which has nothing to do with utility or purpose of any particular kind. We can find meaning in what we do, and we can find purpose and utility, but these things are not an exhaustive description of who and what we are, because as somewhat generally intelligent systems, we're just too complex to fit in any one box. And it could well be the case that artificial intelligences of various forms also have that property, so that as they become more general, they also become more contingent, and we're less able to look at them as utilitarian entities. And again, then we have to accord them an ethical consideration in the way that we would both ourselves and various non-human animals. So a consequence of this may be that when we're looking at artificial intelligence from a utilitarian perspective, we're going to have to make a trade-off between efficiency and potency with some sorts of tasks, so that we're going to require a range of intelligences to fulfill the tasks that we are looking to have fulfilled. And just because we may have access to certain kinds of fairly general artificial intelligence doesn't mean that we're going to want to stop using very narrow forms of AI, to the extent that the two might be considered exclusive anyway. And certainly as we get towards very general kinds of intelligence and generality to the point that we might associate with ourselves, or again with other non-human animals, we may become or find ourselves uncomfortable with the notion that we should be enslaving such entities to any particular utilitarian kind of outcome. But look, there's probably also space to make an argument that we may very well have some very potent and powerful artificial intelligences or optimization systems that will be able to perform very high-level abstract intellectual activities and do so in very neat, efficient ways, and in such a way that they don't entail the kind of complexity that we associate with our intelligence, and that perhaps would be a very neat outcome for economies or civilizations, at least in some contexts. But that remains to be seen, and it's not obvious whether the sorts of artificial intelligences that we may anticipate being on the way are going to have that characteristic. So there's a conversation to be had, but it seems to me at least that the strong intuition is that as intelligence gets more general, it'll get more complex and it will contain more contingencies and be more worthy of moral and ethical consideration for those reasons. Consciousness is one of those concepts which is notorious in its breadth and in the number of ways in which we could define it. Certainly, though, that there are notions of consciousness that are more philosophically challenging, arguably. In contemporary analytic philosophy, one of the key aspects of consciousness that is considered truly challenging relates to the notion of qualia, phenomenal states. So this is a conception that there is something that it is like to be a particular conscious entity, and that likeness involves qualitative properties. And the issue with qualitative properties is that it seems very hard to insert them into the ontology of the physical world, because by nature it's very difficult to determine analogues with our physical concepts of reality that, or indeed metrics, measurements that can be used to find a place for qualitative states. So the mere notion of qualitativity is challenging when we have a view of reality which is defined by our ability to describe the universe in terms of quantity, in terms of the way we cut things up and express reality as the relationship of one part to another. Qualities don't seem to permit that, at least if we take them seriously in a way that there is a strong intuition that we should. So the quality of redness, the actual redness of red, or the hurtiness of pain, or more complex qualities that describe what it is like to be sitting in this room speaking right now, seem to have something inherent about them that we miss out on if we simply describe these things in terms of physical properties of brain states, which we are sure must be strongly correlated with these things, but somehow don't seem to really capture the essence of what it is that we want to explain. So, on at least one conception of consciousness, consciousness is having qualia, having individual phenomenal states and that these phenomenal states really define what it is like to be a conscious entity. And this is certainly the conception of consciousness which raises the hard problem, as David Chalmers would describe it. So there are many other conceptions of consciousness that are important and interesting and difficult, but the real philosophical challenge seems to be in accommodating qualia. And of course, this is not just a descriptive challenge, but it is also, in a sense, a question that we need to ask about the range of systems, including artificial and natural systems, that we think might exhibit qualia. Well, self-determination, by that I'm going to understand you meaning, can we make choices? And there is to some degree an intuitive sense that in a deterministic or semi-deterministic world, free choice or free will may seem complex or difficult to understand. We have a number of things like free will in philosophy. Maybe another analogue is semantics or intentionality. There sometimes seems to be essences or mysterious features to things which give the impression that these properties could not be understood in terms of simpler properties. So there is an intuition, for example, that semantics can't be described in terms of syntax, or that there's no place for free choice in a conception of the universe where things either seem to be random, perhaps, or determined, and where we really can't even conceive of a category of action outside randomness and determinism. Nonetheless, certainly my view is that these are not particularly problematic problems, that we have some very good accounts of compatibilism which describe how free will can make very good sense in a physicalistic or any other system where our choices are simply randomness or determinism. And likewise, it's arguably also becoming more apparent the way in which semantics can supervene on syntax, if you like. And again, as soon as we disabuse ourselves perhaps of the notion that there is something that is a perfect semantic state or semantic property, or indeed there is something that's a perfect choice, a perfect act of will or choosing, and note that all of these properties exist on a continuum of complexity and sophistication, it becomes much easier to understand, in my view, and of course in the views of others who've given very strong accounts of these topics, the way in which these properties can be successfully accounted for, and the way in which they needn't deeply threaten our physicalist ontologies. Certainly, just to expand a little bit, if we view a system which contains choices externally as a closed system, there's a sense in which choice may not make sense, or it may seem to not really exist. But there are certainly patterns in systems, and the patterns are objectively there in a way that Dennett has clearly described. And we could think, for example, of the motion of molecules in a sealed container. It makes sense to talk about those molecules as being free in their motion, even though in some sense the total complex, the total aggregate of the system inside the container is somehow a deterministic system that isn't free and let me say that it isn't free, that's probably enough. But we can understand the freedom of the individual molecules as parts of the system, and roughly speaking, we can understand free will and free choice in terms of the way they describe constituent parts of the universe. They tell a story about how we have expectations and responsibilities and how these things have a big impact on action and agency in systems. So there's certainly a coherent top-level objective part of the explanation for behaviour. We can always try to describe objective, or let me say not objective, but abstract top-level properties in terms of lower-level properties that they supervene on. But that's not to say that the existence of these properties is not objective. The patterns are real, and therefore we have every entitlement and right to speak about these things as really existing, even though they may supervene on something similar, simpler. And of course, as we look at reality in more and more fundamental ways, we lose more and more of our common sense notions of what we might regard as real or significant or important. But there's no reason not to regard these kinds of top-level properties as being of importance. The notion that we could not have choices is hard to pin down, because if we didn't have choice at all, we would fail to be agents, and then it's hard to know in what sense we would even be we or things that could be talked about in these ways. If we do have a magical kind of sense of free choice and free will, then perhaps we could ask that question, though for those of us who are persuaded that there is no really such concept on the table, we already have the answer in that there is no difference. Everything that we need out of choice exists in a system as we already understand ourselves. So we can put that question to one side, essentially. Some of what we choose, or some of the choices we make, are more or less easy to understand in various ways at various times, but there's nothing ultimately magic about choice, but it is a very important concept in terms of the way we make sense of ourselves and those around us and our society more generally. Planning for the future is a difficult one because, well, arguably, firstly, we don't do as much of it overall as a society as perhaps we should. There are, of course, a huge number of factors to think about and to consider. Certainly, one thing I would want to suggest is that we need to take the future perhaps more seriously than we do. Even if the rate of change remains constant as it currently is, change is fast enough that the future isn't what it used to be. And society, our social systems, the way we live our lives are now dynamic. We can't make assumptions about any one human's lifespan in terms of what it will entail or what it will be about. So it's time, in my view, to put futurism, if you like, centre stage. It would be great to see more of it in the educational system, in public debate. It would help if we get beyond the notion that talking about the future is kind of a sci-fi recreation. There's nothing wrong with that, and in fact I think that has a very important place and a very important role to play, that we exercise our imaginations as freely as we can and have lots of divergent thinking about the future. But we need to approach the complexities of our consideration about the future at a societal level, because there are so many complex questions. There are problems to be solved, but there are also opportunities to be embraced. And so we certainly need to be mindful of coming up with good answers to some of the challenges that lie ahead, not least of which include issues like climate change. But it's also important to think about the future, in my view, as a path where hopefully we're heading towards greater freedom and greater creative opportunity. So the future doesn't have to be simply about determining one-size-fits-all best solution. We should be able to be playful about the future. We should be able to see it as a blank canvas that can be filled in all kinds of ways. So we want to be, to at least some degree, pluralistic and diverse in our approach to how we imagine multiple futures, multiple coexisting futures. And if we combine then those notions of taking the future seriously with also being creative and pluralistic in our approach to the future, I think we will be very well placed to guide ourselves down multiple positive paths. But we need to be inclusive. I think that there is an incredible amount to be excited about the future. There is already ample evidence that despite all kinds of glitches and all kinds of problems, our historical trajectory is a very positive one. Steven Pinker's book, The Angels of Our Better Nature, is obviously one very good case in point to that. There is reason to be optimistic that over time we've treated ourselves better, treated each other better, that human life is becoming more open, more free, that there are more opportunities for self-empowerment, for self-realization, that we can hope to have more intrinsically motivated experiences, more creative possibilities, that we can see a future where there is less suffering and more hope. Now, some of that will be technologically mediated, and certainly scientific and technological change is a very important part of the equation. It's probably not enough on its own. In fact, it's almost certainly not enough on its own, and I wouldn't want to choose whether technical progress drives political and social progress or political and social progress creates the space for technical progress. I think the two are highly interdependent. But if we manage things appropriately, and if there are no major disasters, and if the current trajectories continue as they are, there are very good reasons to think that we should be able to continue to discern a progressive trait or current in our society where we're seeing both moral and political, or ethical, I'd rather that word than moral, political and technical progress in ways that makes life less arduous, more interesting and more fulfilling, and hopefully more meaningful, though there are challenges around that too, around how we will encounter and define meaning for ourselves and as a society more broadly in the future. And I think we're already seeing some of that in certain areas of society where, for example, in Western societies, certainly in advanced knowledge-based economies, in many, or at least some situations, the dignity of labour, so to speak, has kind of been eroded over time, and a certain proportion of workforce that would have found a lot of dignity and meaning in labour-intensive activities now no longer has that option open to them. This is not necessarily an insurmountable challenge, but it's a current that we should identify because it's important, and it will probably only increase as, for example, perhaps white-collar work becomes increasingly automated. It's going to be important to make sure that the large portions of society that currently find meaning and applicability in their efforts are moved to a different level as those efforts become superseded by technology, at least in many cases. And certainly there's been some good writing on this subject recently, in my view, about how the future offers us an opportunity to move to more high-level, more heuristic, in some ways more empathic and more right-brain kinds of activities. But in so doing that, we need to make sure that everyone can participate at that top level, and that we don't have an increasingly large underclass who feels that the bright, shiny future has no place for them and their capacities and their abilities, and that in some sense they can't contribute to the world. There are a number of ways we could solve and approach that problem, and again, there could be technological mediations for that problem, or there might be other ways to investigate solutions. But it is one portion of the future, as promising as I think things have the potential to be, that we really need to be mindful of, because as much as we like having an exciting world around us, we also want to be a part of it. And if we're not a part of it, then it suddenly stops being as exciting. In my view, the debate about qualia will become increasingly significant. That's to say, it will be important to some, and it will be a topic that we at least should be engaging with and will need to engage with. As to whether it will be the dominant form in which the public discussion about emerging technologies takes shape, that's another question. I do think that, for example, as we get increasingly intelligent machines, and we start to wonder what the ethical implications of intelligent machines are, and we get to the point where these things become perhaps things that we want to empathise with, a lot of the debate will probably emerge in terms of existing religious or other cultural conversations and vocabularies, which is not ideal, but we also need to be realistic. So it's going to be perhaps a difficult pathway to make sure that as we're considering the kinds of issues that in my view and the views of many other people are going to become important in the future, that we do it at in an appropriate way, using the kinds of concepts that these conversations demand. Something that I think will happen is that we'll see people try to fit religious or spiritual conversations into these debates in a way that exceeds their design specification. And certainly for this reason, I think religious and so-called spiritual frameworks for understanding life and for understanding the universe are going to become increasingly strained and increasingly incapable of dealing with the complexities and sophistication of the situation on the ground, if you like. And so they'll either break or they will put their feet down and just insist in their applicability and significance. And that will, if that latter is what happens, then we'll have a dangerous situation where we have oversimplification and reaction. Having said that, it does seem that people in the final analysis, at least in some scenarios, tend to be rather pragmatic in their approach to these sorts of issues, and in fact to life in general. There's only a certain amount of intense idealism out there in the community, and people will use a degree of common sense in the way they make judgments about issues. Now that won't always be enough, but it could be that if that wins through, then if people don't want to completely dismiss their existing belief systems, for example, they'll just find ways to revise or wrap those systems around whatever new ideas or new views come along that they might need to embrace, as has been going on for a very long period of time. And in the process of that, we could see perhaps a greater conversion to a rationalistic worldview, as that worldview to some becomes increasingly obviously the only one that has, again, the clarity and sophistication to really be able to make sense of what's going on. But on the other hand, we may see, particularly from those that believe what they say they believe, so to speak, an entrenchment. So there's a complex debate ahead, and hopefully conversations around Qualia and around the philosophy of mind will become more public and will become more mainstream, because they will offer the only way to make good progress when we are considering not just issues related, for example, to artificial intelligence, but also issues related to, as Peter Singer would put it, the expanding circle of our ethical considerations in whichever direction we want to put those. There is a strong intuition that's almost universally shared, I would imagine, that consciousness is some kind of important thing that we need to understand and plays a part in the way we consider our values and consider ethics. So it's important that those intuitions are played out using terms that can do them justice. Well, the conditions under which something has qualia are perhaps up for grabs to some degree. There are certain arguments defending the notion that, say, a silicon-based AI couldn't have qualia. That's certainly not the position that I would take, and I would take the view increasingly that that's a fraught and very difficult to defend position. Certainly, most conceptions of qualitative consciousness, it would seem relatively straightforward that if a biological system has qualia, then any other kind of similar system should have qualia. There doesn't seem to be anything specific about biological tissue as a supervenient space for consciousness. So, in a nutshell, there's no reason to think that if machines like us don't have qualitative or do have qualitative experiences, then systems with similar functional properties wouldn't have the same. And this is certainly, if you look at key commentators like Dennett and Chalmers, even though they're on different sides of the ontological divide with regard to monism, dualism, they would both certainly take that view, and in fact you wouldn't find that many who are willing to challenge that view. So certainly I would side with that consensus view that consciousness can arise in a range of systems that have the appropriate functional properties. How we carve up those functional properties is a different question. My view on this is that we should be primarily concerned not with the ontological question, but really with the ethical questions about consciousness, and that we should be able to deal with these questions effectively without needing to answer the ontological question, which is perhaps a less orthodox view, but it would certainly seem that if we determine a system to have the kinds of properties that we in ourselves and amongst each others and with non-human animals consider worthy of ethical consideration, then that should be enough. Then there is no need to answer a further question about whether such a system has qualia in order to somehow fill out its status as an ethical system with a certain kind of special source, if you like. Again, we can exercise the notion that we have to determine the existence of a magic property in order to answer the kinds of ethical questions that are important. So whether we use our intuitive empathic sensibilities or whether we're depending on more sophisticated ethical frameworks, and indeed we may need to build significantly more broad and far-reaching frameworks than we currently have when we're looking at kind of the space of intelligent artifacts or other entities that we may want to ask questions about with respect to ethical considerations. There is a sense in which, in my view, we reach a kind of absurd conclusion when we canvass the possibility that a system could fulfill all the right functional properties or intentional properties that would, in our view, make it merit some kind of ethical consideration, but be missing this magical qualitative layer. Certainly, when we consider systems that have content that we might consider conscious, or that we might consider to be correlated with qualitative states, we can imagine a system, or systems like us, speaking about their qualitative experience as we do. And there's a sense in which we can always scoop that content away from the conversation. So if a system is in pain, is suffering, is experiencing pleasure, is reflecting on their consciousness, we can understand those things in functional terms. We can obviously say a huge amount about what it's like to be conscious and what it's like to have qualia. And yet we also know that all of these things that we say, by the virtue of the fact that we say them, we can explain them in functional terms, in terms of brain states. So no matter what property we put our finger on, no matter what self-reported property we determine as being ethically important, we can always scoop that away from the qualitative side of the equation and say, well, here is the functional state that we care about here. And if what we have then is an isolated phenomenal property, let's say a pain state that has no intentional property, that's sort of floating freely in space, it's hard to see that this pain in a box, if you like, that's isolated from a system and sort of just hovers ontologically to one side of it, is something that should render it a whole new ethical significance, when it is in fact quite disconnected from the system. But certainly someone such as Dennett would likely make the argument that this in itself is enough to upset the whole notion of qualia from the very start. And Chalmers, who would defend the notion of a property dualism about qualia, certainly concedes that there's a paradox about the way we make judgments about these qualitative properties that don't seem to be causally related to our thoughts about them. And Chalmers proposes a certain number of solutions to this problem, but it's not necessarily clear that those solutions are entirely successful. So on the one hand, we have someone such as Dennett arguing that we should simply abandon the intuition that qualitative properties are there, and someone such as Chalmers arguing that they must exist even if they throw up all these difficulties about access, about our actual knowledge of the fact that we're conscious. And certainly if we can't establish that a system actually, in terms of its functional awareness of itself, can know anything about its phenomenal status. So, for example, that my brain can actually know whether I'm in pain qualitatively, even if I'm in pain quantitatively, we seem to strike a situation where it's absurd to consider that this pain state to which we don't have functional access is the thing that arbitrates our ethical considerations. Now, my view there would be that there are reasons to think that, in fact, the relationship between the qualitative state, which I do think we need to take seriously to some degree, and the physical functional state, which I also think we need to take seriously to some degree, why these things are not separable entities. Certainly, Chalmers, for example, has made some great arguments about why in practice physical and functional states wouldn't come apart, and the notion that they would not co-vary is absurd, and certainly his absent, fading, dancing Qualia arguments are very powerful in this regard. And of course on the Dennettian reductive materialist kind of side, you get that for free, because in effect the functional state simply is the quale. My view is a little different, and without going into detail about it right here, and if the opportunity arises I may cover this at the Singularity Summit. My view would be that if we're really going to treat consciousness seriously, we can't by default help ourselves to the physical world any more than we can help ourselves to the phenomenal world. And certainly a lot of commentators such as, again, let me just stick with Dennett and Chalmers, help themselves to the physical world and then decide how they're going to integrate the phenomenal world on top of that. It seems to me that the physical and the phenomenal world kind of both implicate each other in some way, but from the physical standpoint, even though we can in physical functional states richly represent phenomenal states, and we know this because of the way we can articulate our intuitions about being phenomenally conscious, that we can have very complex, rich content that pertains to our experience. But in a sense, starting from that physical side, we don't ever feel that we quite get to the heart of the phenomenal experience. We kind of represent it or point to it, but the actual ontological reality is only sort of there. We don't get the full property. But if we start from the phenomenal side, we find that there's a symmetry. We have exactly the same conundrum, that we have this implication of physical world, but our phenomenal experience never quite actually pulls it in and gives us the physical solidity of the existing universe. So we kind of have this oscillation depending on which side of the ontological equation we start from, and it would certainly seem that from either perspective, if we have physical states, they seem to be necessary for phenomenal states. It seems to be the case that we don't expect things to be conscious unless they have the right kind of physical arrangement, the right kind of functional states to underlie a phenomenal consciousness. And the phenomenal consciousness seems to be sufficient for the physical states, because given this direction, we assume that the physical states have to underpin the phenomenal states. So we have, if our physical ontology is our primary ontology and our phenomenal ontology is our secondary ontology, then it seems to be the case that the secondary ontology is sufficient for the primary ontology, and the primary ontology is necessary for the secondary ontology, but not vice versa in each case. And if we flip over to the phenomenal side, we can see that the phenomenal ontology is necessary for the physical ontology. We have to have experiences to discern the possibility of a physical universe. And likewise, the physical ontology is sufficient to evidence the existence of the phenomenal ontology. So we end up with a very weird symmetric situation about reality, and we also end up taking a very odd step of not helping ourselves to the physical world, which is very counterintuitive, because it's not usually how we think about things. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that one analogous situation, and I want to understate that this is only something I'm pointing to analogously, or as an analogy, would be the way we look at particles and waves in quantum mechanics, where it certainly seems that we can't entertain a parallelism where we simply have two kinds of entities side by side. Certainly, if you look at a double slit diffraction experiment, under some circumstances, a photon is going to act like a particle, and in some circumstances, it's going to act like a wave, but it's not necessarily going to act like both simultaneously. So, with respect to consciousness, we have a similar kind of ontological oscillation, which doesn't necessarily point to a kind of parallel reality to both things. It could point to an underlying third property, which has been suggested in many cases, but it's not clear that physicality and phenomenality need necessarily, in my view, to be associated with some mysterious third property, or that would bias any particular explanatory value, any more than the notion that a photon is a consistent thing that behaves consistently in all situations, if only we could understand the consistent core between wave and particle behavior. Similarly, I don't think we need to see our split between ontology, physical and phenomenal ontology, as being something that has to imply a consistent core. We can nonetheless say that in much the same way in quantum mechanics, where one approach is classically the Copenhagen interpretation, to simply say, well, the system answers to our rational arguments, but it defies an intuitive comprehension. I think a good approach with consciousness as well is to say, well, look, we can illustrate this kind of system which answers to our intuitions about both the physical and the phenomenal world, but has this kind of frustrating intuitive inconsistency, and perhaps is, in a sense, inconsistent in that the way the system looks depends on which side we interrogate it as being in the first instance, either the physical or the phenomenal, just as we would find that when we probe a double slit diffraction experiment. Again, speaking strictly in terms of analogy, not trying to create any association between quantum mechanics and consciousness. So on that view, even though we land at something counterintuitive, if we take that view of consciousness, then what we can assume is that physical, functional, and phenomenal states don't come apart. That if we find a physical functional system that seems worthy of ethical consideration, then to whatever degree that system entails phenomenal properties, or seems to entail the kind of complexity that we would understand as being associated with phenomenal properties, there's no additional question to ask about whether the phenomenal property is there or not. There is a further technical question perhaps to ask about whether what I've canvassed entails a supervenience that's either logical or metaphysical. And certainly my argument to that would be that really the supervenience relation is symmetrical. So if we're asking whether phenomenal states supervene on physical states, we're kind of asking the wrong question already, because it's not so much a relationship of supervenience as kind of mutual interdependence. So that's a broad system for understanding consciousness that enables us to effectively count out the ontological question and simply ethically compute, if you like, using, whether it's our intuitive ethical judgment or our sophisticated ethical systems that we need to develop. And this would be my answer about how we need to treat questions about the ethical status of artificial intelligences, as well as ourselves, as well as non-human animals. Of course, it's up for grabs. I do think in practice, going forward, the debate will probably materialise just from a pragmatic point of view in such a way that ultimately our sense of ethical, our sense of empathy will have a big impact, for better or worse, on how we accord ethical due to other systems, as it already does with respect to each other and with respect to non-human animals, and perhaps even to some degree already artifacts such as computers, which clearly people can sometimes show a certain amount of affection for.